This is the story that tells the tale of a mirror on the wall that told the wicked Queen Snow White was the fairest of them all, the fairest of them all. Snow White.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Many, many moons ago, in the midst of winter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen called Gardenia was sewing. While standing by the open window, she pricked her finger, causing 3 droplets of blood to fall upon the snow outside. The image of the black window frame, the red blood, and the white snow became embedded in Queen Gardenia's mind. Soon the queen was to have a daughter, whose hair was as black as the window frame, and whose cheeks were as red as the blood that had fallen on the pure white snow. Remembering the day she had pricked her finger, she called her beautiful little daughter Snow White. Sadly, Queen Gardenia died after giving birth, causing much distress to Snow White's father, King Horatio. After a year had passed, the king took himself another wife, who was to become known as Queen Claudia. She was a glamorous, beautiful queen, but was also an arrogant, nasty, haughty woman who could not bear the sight of anyone who looked remotely as beautiful as her. Queen Claudia had a huge, magnificent looking-glass with imposing gargoyles embossed around its elegant ivory frame. She stood in front of the looking-glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" Suddenly, within the looking-glass that had magical qualities, the face of an old man appeared. He had a shock of grey hair and deep, menacing, dark, foreboding eyes.
"Claudia, Claudia, I answer your call to tell of the fairest of them all,"
he replied with an air of mystery, and then added,
"Her cheeks are rose red, and her hair black as night. For the girl that I speak of is known as Snow White."
The queen turned green with envy. From that moment on, she could not look at her stepdaughter Snow White without feeling enraged with jealousy. Her envy turned to hatred, causing her many sleepless nights. The wicked queen called upon a local huntsman, to whom she gave a handful of gold and silver coins. "Take Snow White into the woods," she said, "and be sure to kill her. Then throw her body to the wild creatures of the night, and at last I will be the fairest of them all. Once you have achieved your goal, bring me back her heart, as proof that you have carried out the job I have paid you for." The huntsman did as instructed by the queen. He bundled Snow White into a sack and took her to a secluded woodland area in order to carry out the evil deed. But he stopped in his tracks as Snow White appealed to the softer side of his nature. "Please, dear man, spare me my life. I promise I will disappear deep into the woods and make sure I am never seen again." The huntsman took pity on Snow White and let her run off into the woods. "Oh, well," he said, "at least I won't have Snow White's death on my conscience. And if the woodland creatures attack her and eat her, it will have nothing to do with me." He then hunted down a wild boar, took out its heart, and presented it to the queen, claiming it was that of Snow White. Night was approaching, and poor Snow White was alone in the dark woods, with the howling wind shaking the leaves of the trees, causing her to feel vulnerable and very frightened indeed. She saw many fierce-looking animals, but managed to avoid eye contact with them. Using the moon as her only source of light, she negotiated her way across a huge lake by jumping across some precariously spaced stepping stones. When she reached the other side of the lake, she came to a small pink and blue-coloured tumbled-down cottage with a rather badly thatched roof and a chimney pot that had seen better days. She knocked at the door, but there was no reply. She then opened the door and entered the cottage. To Snow White's surprise, unlike the outside, the inside was neat and tidy. It had a table that was set with 7 plates of food, 7 knives and forks, and 7 little cups of milk. Against the wall were 7 little beds covered in ruby red and royal blue blankets. By now, Snow White was so hungry that she ate vegetables and meat from each of the 7 plates and took a sip of milk from each cup. Then, tired and still traumatized from the terrible things she had endured earlier, she decided to sleep on one of the beds. The first 6 she tried did not suit her, one being too low, another too short, another too hard, another too soft, another too itchy, and another a little too lopsided. But the 7th bed suited her perfectly, and she fell into a deep, deep sleep. Suddenly, around midnight, the owners of the cottage came home. They were 7 dwarfs whose job in life was to dig the mountains for ore. They noticed at once that they had an intruder in their midst. The first dwarf said,
"Who's been sitting in my chair?"
The second said,
"Who's been eating off my plate?"
The third said,
"Who's been eating my food?"
The fourth said,
"And who's been eating mine?"
The fifth said,
"Who's been using my fork?"
The sixth said,
"Who's been using my knife?"
And finally the 7th asked,
"Who's been drinking from my cup?"
And then he looked around and saw a bump beneath the blanket on his bed.
"Who's that sleeping in my bed?"
He exclaimed. The 7 dwarfs all gathered around the bed and saw Snow White lying there, deep in the land of dreams, far away from the nightmarish reality she had encountered only hours before.
"Oh, my!
The first dwarf cried.
What a lovely child!"
The kindly dwarfs were so enchanted at the sight of Snow White that they let her sleep on in the bed. That night, the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so passed the night. The next morning, Snow White woke up and was indeed alarmed at the sight of the 7 dwarfs pottering around the cottage. But they were very friendly towards her and asked her name.
"Don't be shy, tell us,"
said the first dwarf. "Snow White," she answered. "My name is Snow White."
"What brings you here to our tumble-down cottage?"
asked the second dwarf.
"Yes, it's a strange choice,"
said the third.
"It's hardly inviting from the outside."
Snow White told the 7 dwarfs of her stepmother's wish to have her killed and how the huntsman had spared her life. The dwarfs were shocked to learn that the wicked stepmother Snow White referred to was none other than Queen Claudia. The 4th dwarf said,
"If you stay in our home, we shall look after you. and you shall want for nothing, my dear."
Snow White was delighted, and although the cottage was not the palace she was used to, she loved her new abode and her new friends, the 7 dwarfs. Over the ensuing weeks, whilst the 7 dwarfs were at work searching for copper and gold, Snow White would keep their home tidy and make sure there was food on the table for them when they returned from a hard day's toil. But one day, over a feast of broth and dumplings, the 5th dwarf said to Snow White,
"Beware, dear girl. Your stepmother will soon find that you are here with us, so be sure you let no one into our humble abode."
Meanwhile, back at the palace, the evil Queen Claudia, believing she had devoured Snow White's heart, preened around the palace, thinking she was the fairest of them all. Oozing confidence, she approached the looking-glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mysterious man appeared immediately and replied,
Although Queen Claudia is a heavenly sight, the fairest of all is a girl called Snow White. She is alive and lives over the dell. Thanks to 7 kind dwarves, Snow White's looking so well.
The queen was astounded, as she knew the man in the looking-glass never conveyed anything but the truth. However, she had to accept the huntsman had betrayed her, and that Snow White was very much alive. She contemplated how she might kill Snow White, the girl who was preventing her from being the fairest of them all. She dressed up as an old peddler woman and walked up to the door of the 7 dwarfs' rickety old cottage. She knocked on the door and cried in a cackling voice, "Pretty things to sell, my lovelies, very cheap indeed." Snow White popped her head out of the window and said, "Good day, kind woman. What have you to sell?" "Good things," she answered. "Laces of all colours and sizes." And she pulled out handkerchiefs made out of the most beautiful silk. The trusting Snow White ignored the dwarf's warning and opened the door to the fragile, kindly-looking old peddler woman. "Oh dear," said the old peddler woman, looking Snow White up and down, "you look so unsightly, but with a little help from me you can be transformed. Come, let me lace you properly." Snow White was enamoured with the bright array of laces and allowed the old dear to wrap them around her. But she wrapped them so tightly that poor Snow White found it hard to breathe, and she fell to the floor as if dead. "Hey, now who is the fairest of them all?" Queen Claudia cackled as she made her way back to the palace, laughing all the way. When the dwarfs returned to the cottage, they were alarmed to find Snow White lying in a heap on the floor. After much discussion, they cut her free from the laces. Suddenly, Snow White began to breathe again, and her life was spared. The dwarves concluded that the peddler woman was none other than Snow White's stepmother, Queen Claudia. The next day, the wicked queen asked the looking-glass, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mysterious old man appeared and replied,
Snow White is the fairest of them all, for she is alive and well. The girl was saved by the 7 dwarves from just beyond the dell.
curses, wept the queen. She is still alive, but I will put an end to her once and for all. For the second time the wicked queen approached the door of the dwarf's cottage. She was disguised as an old travelling woman, selling items such as heather and other cheap items. "Good things to sell," she cried out. "All cheap, so cheap." Snow White looked out of the window and said, "Go away. I am not allowed to open the door to you." "But you could look," said the old woman, who produced a poisoned comb that had been tainted by an evil spell which would ensure Snow White could not resist purchasing it. As soon as she opened the door, the old woman started to comb Snow White's hair, thus poisoning her immediately. Poor Snow White fell to the floor at the door of the cottage and seemed to be well and truly dead. "At last I am the fairest of them all," pronounced the queen, and left chuckling all the way back to the palace. Shortly after the evil queen's departure, the dwarves returned to find their little friend slumped in a heap by the door.
"Take that comb from her hair,"
said the sixth dwarf.
"It looks suspicious."
And as the comb was removed from her hair, Snow White came round. It transpired that the comb had not had time to completely overpower her.
"You must be more vigilant, Snow White,"
said the seventh dwarf.
"Never open the door to anyone ever again."
Meanwhile, Queen Claudia peered smugly into the looking-glass once more. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mysterious man replied,
Snow White's the fairest of them all. She is very much alive. The 7 dwarves have found her, and they've helped her to survive.
The queen raged. "Snow White will die, even if it costs me my own life." She then produced a nice, big, juicy, enticing apple that was poisonous to the core. The queen gave herself a potion that would protect her from the poison in the apple. Dressed as a farmer's wife, she knocked at the door of the dwarves' cottage. "Apples for sale, lovely, luscious apples!" she cried. Snow White peered from the window. "Go away, please," she said. "I'm not allowed to speak to you." "Are you afraid it might be poisonous?" said the farmer's wife. "Look, I'll take a bite to prove that it's safe to sample my wares." On seeing that the apple had caused no harm to the farmer's wife, Snow White agreed to sample a taste. She opened the door and gracefully accepted the apple, taking a huge bite. Suddenly, Snow White began choking violently and fell down, dead. The queen laughed. "The 7 dwarves will fail now. Snow White is no more." As soon as she got home, the queen went to the looking-glass. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The man in the looking-glass replied,
You are the fairest of them all. That cannot be denied. For from the poison apple, Snow White choked and died.
"Ah!" said the elated queen. "I knew it!" Meanwhile, the 7 dwarfs had found Snow White and declared her dead. There was no clue as to what had happened, for the queen had taken the rest of the apple with her. As they went to bury Snow White, one of the dwarfs tripped, causing the coffin to bounce against a tree, and the piece of apple stuck in Snow White's mouth popped out, giving her the chance to breathe again. As soon as she came round, she told the dwarfs what had happened to her.
"It's a disgrace,"
said the first dwarf.
"I agree,"
said the second. Between them, they hatched a plot that involved going to the palace and telling King Horatio exactly what the wicked queen had been up to, and reuniting him with his beloved daughter, Snow White. When the dwarves presented Snow White to the guards outside the palace, they recognized her instantly and let her in with her 7 little companions. The king was over the moon to see his daughter and wept tears of joy. Queen Claudia, on the other hand, flew into a rage. "Curses!" she screamed. "You win, Snow White. You're the fairest of them all, and I'm not happy being second best." She then hurled herself through the looking-glass, which took her into a dark abyss, where she remained forevermore. The looking-glass itself slowly but surely vanished, and was never seen again.
"How strange," said the king. "That looking-glass was jolly expensive. Never really liked it, though. It gave me the creeps."
When the king learnt how Queen Claudia had behaved, he was appalled.
"Good riddance to her," he said. "I've got my daughter back. That's the main thing,"
as he hugged a very happy Snow White. Over the next few years, Snow White grew up in the palace with the 7 dwarfs as her loyal subjects. "Just think," she said to her 7 best friends, "one day I will be queen, and you will be my 7 royal courtiers."
This is the story that tells the tale of a mirror on the wall that told the